In the winter of 1347, in a remote valley nestled between the Carpathian Mountains, there existed a village that the outside world had all but forgotten. Its name was Svedegrad, meaning holy city in the old tongue, though it was hardly more than a collection of stone cottages surrounding a modest monastery. The villagers lived simple lives, bound by devotion, discipline, and an unshakable faith that had been passed down through countless generations. They believed themselves chosen, protected by divine grace from the chaos that plagued the kingdoms beyond their mountains. They were wrong about the protection, but they were right about being chosen, though not in any way they could have imagined. What happened in Svedegrad over the course of 6 brutal weeks would challenge every assumption about faith, community, and the nature of divine communication itself. It's a story that has been deliberately obscured, hidden in the margins of monastic records, and whispered about only in the most hushed tones among certain circles of religious scholars. Some say it never happened. Others say it happened still, in different forms, in different places, whenever human beings mistake the voice in their head for the voice of God. But the evidence suggests that something very real, very terrible, and very revealing about human nature unfolded in that forgotten valley 7 centuries ago. This is the story of how heaven's whispers became hell's screams, of how the faithful became the fearful, and how easily the line between divine inspiration and collective madness can be erased. This is a story when faith turned into fear. The monastery of Svedegrad was founded in 1089 by a hermit monk named Simeon, who claimed to have been led to the valley by a vision of the Virgin Mary. According to the founding chronicle, Simeon had been wandering the mountains for 40 days and 40 nights, fasting and praying, when he saw a column of light descending from the heavens onto a specific point in the valley below. When he descended to investigate, he found a natural spring bubbling up from the rocks, and the water, he claimed, had miraculous properties. He built a small chapel beside the spring, and soon other monks joined him. Within a generation, a full monastery had been established, and a village had grown around it to support the monks and house those pilgrims who made the treacherous journey to drink from the holy spring. By 1347, the monastery housed 32 monks, led by an abbot named Dmitri, a man in his 60s who had spent his entire adult life within those walls. The village itself had perhaps 200 souls, most of them farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen whose ancestors had lived in the valley for as long as anyone could remember. They were insular, suspicious of outsiders, and profoundly devout. Mass was held every morning without fail. The monks' chants echoed through the valley at dawn, noon, and vespers. Children were raised on scripture and stories of saints. To be born in Svedegrad was to be born into a community that saw itself as a living embodiment of monastic ideals, where the secular and the sacred were not separate realms but different aspects of the same holy purpose. The first vision came to a novice monk named Mikhail on the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6. Mikhail was 19 years old, the son of a local miller, and by all accounts an earnest, if unremarkable young man who had taken his vows only 8 months earlier. He was praying alone in the chapel before dawn when, he later reported, the air around him suddenly filled with a golden light, and he heard a voice speaking his name. The voice, he said, was neither male nor female, but somehow both and neither, and it resonated not just his ears but through his entire body, as if his very bones were vibrating with its frequency. The voice told Mikhail that Svedegrad had been blessed, that the faithful of this valley had been noticed by heaven, and that in the coming days, many among them would be granted visions to strengthen their faith and prepare them for trials ahead. The voice instructed Mikhail to tell the abbot that the spring water should be shared with all the villagers, that everyone should drink from it daily, and that they should increase their prayers and maintain absolute honesty with one another, for deception of any kind would bar them from receiving the grace that was being offered. When Mikhail reported his vision to Abbot Dmitri, the old monk was skeptical. Visions were not unheard of in monastic life, but they were also not to be taken at face value. The church had long taught that such experiences must be carefully discerned, for demons could appear as angels of light, and the human mind was capable of generating its own hallucinations, especially in states of extreme devotion or deprivation. Dmitri questioned Mikhail extensively, looking for signs of pride, delusion, or heresy in his account. But the young monk seemed genuinely humbled by the experience, even frightened by it. He had no desire for attention or authority. He simply reported what he had experienced and asked for guidance. What convinced Dmitri to take the vision seriously was a detail that Mikhail mentioned almost as an afterthought. The voice had told him something specific about the abbot himself, something that no one else could have known. Years earlier, when Dmitri was a young monk, he had committed a serious transgression, one that he confessed only to God in private prayer, never to another human being. The voice had revealed this secret to Mikhail and told him to relay it to Dmitri as proof of its authenticity. When Mikhail, with great embarrassment, repeated what the voice had said, Dmitri went pale. There was no possible way the young man could have known this information. Either this was a genuine divine communication, or something far stranger and more troubling was occurring. Dmitri decided to follow the voice's instructions, at least provisionally. He ordered that the monastery's supply of spring water be distributed to all the villagers, and he called for increased prayer and devotion throughout the community. He also instructed everyone to practice rigorous honesty, explaining that deception of any kind, even small social lies, must be avoided. He did not explain why he was issuing these directives, saying only that he had received guidance that this was necessary for the spiritual health of the community. Within 3 days, 5 more people reported having visions. A shepherd named Yuri heard a voice while tending his flocks on the mountainside. A widow named Katerina saw a figure of light while drawing water from the village well. 2 monks, both senior members of the community, experienced visions during their private prayers. And most strikingly, a child, a 7-year-old girl named Anastasia, told her mother that an angel had visited her in a dream and told her that everyone in the village was going to become like the saints in the stories, able to see and hear things that normal people could not. The content of these visions varied, but certain themes were consistent. All of them emphasized the special status of Svetograd, the importance of honesty, the need for increased prayer and devotion, and the promise that more visions would come. Some of the visions included specific information, personal details about the recipients or others in the community, that seemed impossible for the person to have known through ordinary means. A voice would tell someone about a secret sin committed by another villager, or reveal knowledge of an event that had happened far away, beyond the mountains, that no one in the valley should have known about. Abbot Dmitri found himself in an impossible position. The rational part of his mind urged caution. Mass visions could be signs of collective hysteria, ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, or even demonic influence. But the content of the vision seemed orthodox. The people experiencing them were diverse in age and temperament, and some of the specific knowledge revealed seemed genuinely inexplicable through natural means. Moreover, the visions were having a profound effect on the community. People were more devout, more honest with one another, more committed to prayer and spiritual discipline. The village seemed to be experiencing a genuine spiritual awakening. By the end of the second week, 23 people had reported visions, roughly a quarter of the adult population. The monastery was alive with excitement and fervor. Prayers went on for hours. People confessed long-held secrets and reconciled old grievances. There was a sense that something momentous was happening, that their community really was being touched by divine grace. The voices consistently encouraged this interpretation, telling recipients that they were blessed, chosen, that they should not doubt, but should embrace the gift they were being given. It was during the 3rd week that the first discordant note was struck. A farmer named Stanislav, who had received a vision telling him to share his stored grain with poorer families, was approached by another farmer named Gregor, who claimed that he too had received a vision, and that his voice had told him something different. According to Gregor, his voice had said that Stanislav was being tested, that the instruction to give away his grain was actually coming from a demonic source trying to impoverish him and his family. Gregor's voice had instructed him to warn Stanislav and to counsel him to ignore the false vision. This created an immediate dilemma. Both men were known to be honest and devout. Both claimed to have received genuine divine communications, but their visions directly contradicted each other. How could both be true? Stanislav insisted that his vision had been accompanied by overwhelming feelings of peace and love, the traditional signs of divine presence. Gregor countered that his vision had also been accompanied by such feelings, and moreover, that it made rational sense. Why would God ask a man to impoverish his own family? Abbot Dmitri was called in to adjudicate. After praying and questioning both men extensively, he made a judgment based on his understanding of Scripture and church teaching. He declared that Stanislav's vision was genuine and Gregor's was a demonic counterfeit, because sacrificial giving was consistent with Christ's teachings, while the voice that encouraged self-preservation over charity was suspect. Gregor accepted this judgment with poor grace, muttering that perhaps the abbot himself had been deceived. This incident might have been dismissed as an isolated case of confusion or demonic interference, but it set a precedent that would prove catastrophic. Within days, more contradictory visions began to be reported. A voice would tell one person that a certain family was harboring sin and needed to be confronted. Another voice would tell someone else that the first voice was lying, that the family in question was innocent, and that the accuser was being manipulated. Voices began to accuse other voices of being false, demonic, or deceptive. The community's initial response was to double down on prayer and discernment. Abbot Dimitri called for fasting and extended prayer vigils. He established a process for evaluating visions using traditional criteria. Did they conform to church teaching? Did they promote virtue or vice? Were they accompanied by feelings of peace or fear and confusion? Were the recipients humble and willing to submit to authority? But these criteria proved inadequate to the situation because the contradictory visions often met all the traditional markers of authenticity. The people receiving them were sincere. The content was superficially orthodox. The experiential qualities seemed genuine. What made the situation even more complex was that many of the visions contained information that later proved to be accurate. A voice would tell someone that a specific event was going to happen, and it would happen. A voice would reveal a secret, and the secret would turn out to be true. This seemed to validate the reality of the communications. But it also meant that when voices contradicted each other, it was genuinely unclear which one, if either, was telling the truth. By the fourth week, the community was beginning to fracture. Roughly half the adults were now receiving regular visions, and the voices had become more demanding, more specific in their instructions, and more insistent that other voices were false. People began to form factions based on which visions they believed. A voice would tell someone that a particular person was secretly sinful or dangerous, and that person's defenders would claim that the accusation itself came from a demonic source. Prayer meetings devolved into arguments. Families were divided as husbands and wives received contradictory instructions. The voices had become a cacophony, each claiming to be the authentic divine communication, each insisting that the others were deceptions. And because the community had been instructed from the beginning to practice absolute honesty and to trust in the visions they were receiving, people felt compelled to act on what they heard, even when it meant accusing their neighbors, friends, and family members of being deceived or demonically influenced. Abbot Dimitri tried to restore order by declaring a moratorium on new visions. He announced that for a period of 40 days, no one was to act on any vision without bringing it to him first for evaluation. This directive was immediately challenged by multiple people who claimed to have received visions telling them that the abbot was wrong, that he himself had been deceived, and that obedience to him would result in spiritual catastrophe. When Dimitri insisted on his authority as abbot, he was told by several monks that their voices had revealed he was no longer fit to lead, that he had lost the grace of his office, and that God was calling for new leadership. The monastery that had been a bastion of order and hierarchy for centuries was suddenly in chaos. Some monks supported the abbot. Others claimed that the visions superseded earthly authority. The village was no better. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades now viewed each other with suspicion. If you couldn't trust the voice in your own head, and you couldn't trust the voices your neighbors were hearing, how could you trust anything? The very foundation of their community, shared faith and shared experience of the divine, had become a source of division and fear. The situation deteriorated rapidly during the 5th week. A woman named Vera, who had been one of the first to receive visions, stood up during Mass and declared that she had been told by her voice that 2 monks in the monastery were servants of Satan, deliberately spreading false visions to destroy the community. She named them specifically and demanded that they be expelled or executed. The accused monks protested their innocence, and their supporters claimed that Vera herself was the one who had been deceived. The Mass dissolved into shouting and accusations. That night, one of the accused monks, a man named Ilya, disappeared. His body was found 3 days later in the forest, beaten to death. An investigation revealed that a group of villagers, claiming to have received visions instructing them to purge the community of demonic influence, had decided to take matters into their own hands. They insisted they had done God's will, that their visions had been clear and accompanied by all the traditional signs of divine authenticity. They showed no remorse, only confusion that others couldn't see the obvious truth that they had been acting righteously. Abbot Dimitri was horrified. He declared that no vision from God would ever command murder, that the killers had been deceived by demons, and that they must be handed over to secular authorities for punishment. But there were no secular authorities in Svetlograd, only the monastery and the village. And a significant portion of the village now believed that the killers had acted correctly, that Ilya had indeed been corrupted, and that the abbot himself might be compromised. The murder of Ilya marked a point of no return. Fear, which had been building slowly, now gripped the community completely. If visions could lead people to murder and still feel righteous about it, then visions could justify anything. People began to arm themselves. Families barricaded their homes at night. Monks stopped sleeping in their communal dormitory and started locking their individual cells. The voices continued, louder and more insistent, each one claiming to be the truth, each one warning about the deceptions of others. There were still some in the community who tried to resist. A monk named Andrei proposed that everyone simply stop listening to the voices, that they return to traditional practices of prayer and scripture study, and ignore any internal communications that couldn't be verified through ordinary means. He was eloquent and persuasive, and for a moment, it seemed like his message might break through the madness. But that night, Andrei himself received a vision so powerful, so overwhelming, that he emerged from his cell the next morning a changed man. He announced that he had been wrong, that the voices were indeed divine, and that his attempt to suppress them had been inspired by his own pride and fear. The voice, he said, had shown him the truth in a way that could not be denied or resisted. Those who had hoped he might provide a path out of chaos were devastated. What was happening in Svetlograd? Modern analysis suggests several possible explanations, none of them entirely satisfactory on their own. One theory is ergot poisoning. The grain supply could have been contaminated with ergot fungus, which contains compounds similar to LSD and can cause vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and psychotic episodes. This would explain the widespread nature of the visions and their intensification over time. However, it doesn't fully account for the specific content of the visions or the verifiable information some of them contained. Another theory is mass hysteria or psychogenic illness, where the expectation of visions, combined with intense religious fervor and social pressure, created a self-reinforcing cycle of hallucinatory experiences. In this interpretation, the first vision set a template that others unconsciously followed, and the collective belief in the reality of the visions made them psychologically real for participants. This is a well-documented phenomenon in religious and social contexts, but again, it struggles to explain some of the more anomalous details. A third, more unsettling possibility, suggested by some religious scholars, is that the community genuinely did open themselves to spiritual forces, but lacked the discernment to distinguish between different types of spiritual communication. In this view, the initial visions may have been authentic, but their success attracted other influences, whether interpreted as demonic, psychological, or simply as a human capacity for self-deception, that mimicked the original experiences. The tragedy, in this interpretation, was not that they believed in divine communication, but that they had no reliable way to distinguish true communication from false, and their commitment to acting on what they heard made them vulnerable to manipulation from any source that could speak with sufficient authority. Whatever the true cause, the result was undeniable. By the 6th week, Svetlograd was no longer a functioning community. Trust had completely broken down. People heard voices telling them that their neighbors were plotting against them, that the food was poisoned, that only violence would save them. Small groups formed around particular visionaries who claimed to have special clarity or divine authority. But these groups inevitably turned on each other as their respective voices contradicted one another. The final catastrophe came during the first week of Lent. A visionary named Stefan, who had attracted a following of about 30 people, declared that he received a revelation about the true source of the crisis. According to Stefan, the spring water itself had been cursed, not blessed. The original hermit Simeon had been deceived by a demon disguised as a Virgin Mary. And for 2.5 centuries, the monastery had been built on a foundation of spiritual corruption. Everything that had happened, the visions, the divisions, the violence, was a result of this original deception finally being exposed. The only solution, Stephen proclaimed, was to destroy the monastery and the chapel built over the spring, and start over with a new foundation. Stephen and his followers attempted to burn down the monastery chapel. They were met by another group, led by a monk named Vasily, who claimed to have received a vision that the chapel was indeed holy, and that Stephen's revelation was the ultimate demonic lie designed to destroy the last remnant of genuine sanctity in the valley. The two groups fought with improvised weapons, farming tools, knives, clubs. By the time others intervened, 7 people were dead and many more were injured. Abbot Dmitri, who had been trying desperately to hold the community together through prayer, negotiation, and appeals to reason, suffered what was probably a nervous breakdown. He was found in the chapel, weeping and crying out that he could no longer hear anything, that the silence was unbearable, that he had failed everyone. He died 3 days later, some say from a stroke, others say from simple despair. With the abbot dead and the community in open conflict, the remaining voices of moderation decided on a desperate measure. A small group of monks and villagers who had either never received visions or who had chosen to stop listening to them agreed that Svetograd had to be abandoned. They would flee the valley, seek help from church authorities in the distant cities, and never return. They managed to convince about half the surviving population to leave with them. The exodus from Svetograd began in early March. Roughly 100 people, carrying what they could, left the valley and began the treacherous journey through the mountains. Many of them reported that as they climbed higher and put distance between themselves and the valley, the voices began to fade. Some found this a relief. Others found it terrifying, as if they were losing touch with something essential. A few turned back, unable to bear the silence, preferring the chaos of the voices to the emptiness of their absence. Those who continued eventually reached the monastery of St. Nicholas in the city of Kazan, nearly 200 miles away. They told their story to the bishop there, who was deeply disturbed by what he heard. He sent an investigative mission back to Svetograd, accompanied by priests trained in spiritual discernment and exorcism. When they arrived at the valley in late April, they found it largely deserted. Of the 100 or so people who had chosen to remain, only 30 were still alive. Many had died from violence. Others had apparently died from starvation or exposure, having become so consumed by their visions that they stopped eating or caring for themselves. A handful had survived by hiding and avoiding contact with others. The investigating priests spent 2 weeks in Svetograd. They blessed the spring, performed exorcisms throughout the monastery and village, and interviewed the survivors. Their report, preserved in the archives of the diocese, makes for chilling reading. The survivors were in various states of psychological and spiritual distress. Some were catatonic. Others were manic, still insisting that they were receiving divine guidance and that everyone else had been deceived. A few seemed to have regained some measure of sanity, but they were traumatized by what they had witnessed and participated in. The bishop's conclusion was that Svetograd had suffered a demonic attack of unprecedented sophistication. The initial visions, he believed, might have been authentic divine communications, but they had been quickly corrupted and overwhelmed by demonic counterfeits that exploited the community's devotion and desire for spiritual experience. He ordered the monastery permanently closed, the spring sealed, and the village abandoned. Svetograd was to be forgotten, its story suppressed to prevent others from being led into similar error. But was the bishop correct in his assessment? Or was he simply providing the theological explanation that made sense within his worldview? The truth is, we may never know for certain what happened in Svetograd. What we do know is that a community bound by faith, united by devotion, and living in deliberate isolation from the corrupting influences of the outside world managed to destroy itself in a matter of weeks, not despite their faith, but because of how they practiced it. The story of Svetograd offers disturbing lessons about the nature of religious experience and the dangers of certainty. These were not bad people. They were not weak-minded or gullible. They were sincere believers trying their best to be faithful to what they understood as divine communication. The visions they experienced were real to them, phenomenologically indistinguishable from what we would consider authentic religious experience. And yet, the result was catastrophic. One of the most troubling aspects of the story is how quickly the community's greatest strength became its greatest vulnerability. The emphasis on honesty, which initially seemed to strengthen bonds and deepen trust, became a weapon. When someone received a vision accusing another person of secret sin or deception, the cultural commitment to honesty meant that the accusation had to be voiced, investigated, and taken seriously, even if it was baseless. The very virtue that was supposed to protect them became the mechanism of their destruction. Similarly, the community's deep respect for religious experience and divine communication meant they had no effective defense against experiences that felt religious and divine but led to harmful outcomes. The traditional tools of discernment proved inadequate because the deceptive visions mimicked the authentic ones too well, and the more they struggled to distinguish truth from falsehood, the more confused and desperate they became. There's also the question of authority and hierarchy. Svetograd had a clear leadership structure in the monastery and a respected abbot. But when individual visionary experiences were elevated to the same level or higher than institutional authority, that structure collapsed. If anyone could claim to have received direct divine communication that superseded the abbot's judgment, then there was effectively no authority at all, only competing claims to divine favor. The result was not freedom or spiritual democracy, but chaos and violence. Modern readers might wonder why the people of Svetograd didn't simply stop believing in the visions once they started to lead to harmful outcomes. But this misunderstands the phenomenology of religious experience. For those experiencing the visions, they were not beliefs that could be easily abandoned. They were direct perceptions, as real and immediate as seeing or hearing in the ordinary sense. Asking them to ignore their visions would have been like asking them to ignore their own eyes and ears. Moreover, every religious tradition teaches that faith requires trusting in divine guidance even when it's difficult or doesn't make immediate sense. The people of Svetograd were doing what they had been taught to do, trusting in their spiritual experiences and having the courage to act on them. The tragedy is that this trust was misplaced, but there was no obvious way for them to know that from within their own experience. Each person could only judge based on how their visions felt, and feelings are notoriously unreliable guides to truth. The visions that led to violence felt just as holy, just as divine, just as accompanied by peace and certainty as the visions that led to charity and reconciliation. There was no phenomenological difference, only a difference in outcome, and by the time the outcomes were clear, it was too late. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Svetograd is about the necessity of skepticism, even or especially, toward our most powerful and convincing experiences. The people of Svetograd were betrayed not by their faith, but by their certainty. They were so sure that they were hearing divine voices, so confident in their ability to recognize authentic spiritual communication, that they couldn't conceive of being wrong. And that certainty made them vulnerable to any force or phenomenon that could produce convincing religious experiences, whether that force was divine, demonic, psychological, or chemical. In the years following the disaster, the Church used Svetograd as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of enthusiasm and the necessity of institutional oversight of religious experience. But this lesson was selectively applied. When visions and mystical experiences supported church authority and doctrine, they were celebrated as evidence of divine favor. When they challenged authority or led to heterodox conclusions, they were dismissed as deception or delusion. The church, it seemed, wanted the spiritual authority that came from claiming divine communication, but without the risk that such communication might actually occur in unpredictable and uncontrollable ways. The ruins of Svetograd remained abandoned for nearly 2 centuries. The valley was avoided by travelers and locals alike, considered cursed or haunted. In the 16th century, during a period of religious reform, a priest named Father Grigory decided to investigate the site, believing that the story had been exaggerated or misreported. He spent 3 days alone in the ruins of the monastery, praying and fasting. His diary from those days survives, and it makes for unsettling reading. Father Grigory reported that he did indeed experience what he described as voices or impressions that seemed to come from outside his own mind. They were not overwhelming or particularly dramatic, but they were persistent. One voice told him that the spring water was still holy and should be shared. Another voice told him that the spring water was cursed and should never be touched. A third voice told him that both the other voices were true and false simultaneously, that this was a place where the boundaries between divine and demonic had been eroded, and that seeking clear answers was itself a form of spiritual pride. Father Grigory left Svetograd after 3 days, deeply disturbed. He recommended that the site remain sealed, and that no attempt be made to reconsecrate it or rebuild there. Some places, he wrote, have been touched by forces we do not understand, and our ignorance is a better protection than our confidence. The valley remained abandoned. In the modern era, the story of Svetograd has been largely forgotten, existing only in obscure monastic records and a few academic papers about medieval religious communities. But there are those who argue that what happened there is not merely a historical curiosity, but a pattern that repeats whenever human beings become too certain of their ability to distinguish divine communication from other forms of internal experience. Consider the countless religious conflicts throughout history, where both sides claim divine authority for their actions. Consider the individuals who have committed terrible acts while sincerely believing they were following God's will. Consider the cults and movements that have ended in tragedy because a charismatic leader claimed special access to divine truth. In each case, the pattern is similar. Intense religious experience leads to certainty. Certainty leads to action, and action based on false certainty leads to destruction. But here's the paradox. If we accept that religious experience to be deceptive, how do we distinguish true experiences from false ones? And if we can't reliably make that distinction, how can we base any decisions or beliefs on such experiences? The traditional answer is to rely on community discernment, institutional authority, conformity to established doctrine, and the test of outcomes over time. But Svetograd shows us that these safeguards can fail. The community tried to discern. They had institutional authority. The experiences seemed to conform to doctrine, and by the time the outcomes were clear, it was too late. Some religious thinkers have suggested that the lesson of Svetograd is that we should be far more skeptical of dramatic religious experiences than most traditions teach. Perhaps the quiet, undramatic practice of virtue, study, and service is more trustworthy than visions and voices, even when those visions and voices feel overwhelmingly real and holy. Perhaps the absence of dramatic spiritual experience is not a sign of spiritual poverty, but of spiritual health. Perhaps God, if God communicates at all, speaks most reliably to the mundane rather than the miraculous. Others argue that the lesson is different, that genuine divine communication is possible and even common, but that it requires far more sophisticated discernment than we typically practice. In this view, the people of Svetograd failed not because they trusted their experiences, but because they didn't have adequate tools for evaluating them. They needed psychological knowledge, medical knowledge, better understanding of group dynamics and cognitive biases. They needed to ask harder questions, run better tests, and be willing to doubt even their most convincing experiences. A third perspective, offered by some modern spiritual teachers, is that the very framework of asking, is this voice divine or demonic, true or false? Is itself the problem? Perhaps reality is more complex than that binary allows. Perhaps there are many levels and types of communication happening simultaneously: psychological, spiritual, social, neurological, and the attempt to classify them all as simply true or false, God or Satan, prevents us from engaging with them skillfully. In this view, the people of Svetograd were trapped by their own categories, unable to respond flexibly to a situation that defied simple classification. Whatever the correct interpretation, the ruins of Svetograd stand as a monument to the dangers of certainty in matters of faith. They remind us that sincerity is not the same as truth, that powerful experiences are not necessarily trustworthy, and that communities bound by faith can destroy themselves as easily as they can sustain themselves, depending on how that faith is practiced and understood. In recent years, a small movement of pilgrims has begun visiting the site of Svetograd, now accessible by modern roads. They come not to seek visions or miracles, but to remember, to learn, to contemplate the thin line between devotion and delusion. Some leave flowers at the ruins of the chapel. Others simply sit in silence, listening to the wind through the valley, grateful, perhaps, for the absence of voices. The spring still flows, though whether it's holy or cursed or simply water remains a matter of interpretation. The monastery remains in ruins, stones scattered by centuries of weather and neglect. And the story of what happened there 7 centuries ago continues to challenge anyone who believes they can confidently distinguish the voice of God from the voice of their own mind, their own fears, their own desires. Because if faith can turn into fear so quickly, so completely, in a community as devoted and sincere as Svetograd, then it can happen anywhere. It can happen to anyone. The only difference between a religious awakening and a descent into madness might be nothing more than which voice you choose to trust. And we may have far less ability to make that choice correctly than we like to believe. The monks who survived Svetograd and made it to other monasteries spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they had experienced. Some never spoke of it again, maintaining vows of silence on the subject until their deaths. Others became teachers, using their experience to warn others about the dangers of spiritual pride and the necessity of doubt. One monk, Brother Pavel, wrote a small treatise in his old age titled The Silence of God, in which he argued that God's most reliable communication is actually silence, and that the proliferation of voices claiming divine authority is itself a sign of divine absence, not presence. Brother Pavel's argument was considered heretical by some, comforting by others. He wrote that in Svetograd, they had mistaken abundance for blessing, when in fact the abundance of voices was itself the curse. A truly holy place, he wrote, is one where God is so present that no one needs to hear voices, because everyone can see divine truth in the faces of their neighbors, in the bread they share, in the work of their hands. Where voices multiply, trust dies, and where trust dies, God has already left, no matter how holy the voices claim to be. This idea, that the multiplication of divine claims might indicate divine absence rather than presence, is deeply counterintuitive to most religious thinking. We tend to assume that more religious experience is better, that communities rich in visions and miracles are more blessed than those without such experiences. But Svetograd suggests the opposite might be true. Perhaps the communities that function best are those where divine communication, if it occurs at all, is rare, subtle, and primarily communicated through the ordinary virtues of kindness, honesty, and service rather than through extraordinary experiences. There's archaeological evidence that supports this interpretation. Studies of intentional religious communities throughout history show that those which emphasize mystical experiences and direct divine communication tended to be shorter-lived and more prone to conflict than those which emphasize traditional practice, communal work, and ethical behavior. The most stable monasteries and religious communities were often the most boring, places where nothing dramatic ever happened, where monks woke up, prayed, worked, ate, and slept in an unchanging rhythm for decades or centuries. Perhaps there's a reason for that stability. Perhaps the absence of dramatic spiritual experience created space for genuine spiritual growth, while the pursuit of such experiences led to instability and conflict. This raises uncomfortable questions for anyone who values religious experience. Are visions and voices inherently problematic? Should we be suspicious of anyone who claims direct divine communication? The obvious answer is no. Many great saints and mystics reported such experiences, and their insights have enriched religious traditions immensely. But perhaps the key difference is in how such experiences were integrated. The saints and mystics who are remembered positively tend to be those who subjected their experiences to rigorous scrutiny, who doubted themselves more than they doubted others, and who allowed their experiences to be tested against community wisdom and ethical outcomes. The visionaries of Svetograd did none of these things. They assumed their experiences were self-validating. They trusted their feelings over outcomes. They acted on their visions without adequate testing or patience. And when their visions contradicted each other, rather than recognizing this as a sign that something was wrong with their entire approach, they simply assumed that the other person's vision was false and their own was true. This pattern of assuming that contradictory experiences must mean the other person is wrong, rather than questioning the reliability of the experiences themselves, is perhaps the most catastrophic cognitive error the community made. Modern psychology has a term for this: confirmation bias. We tend to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm our existing beliefs and experiences. If you had a powerful vision that felt divine, and then someone else has a vision that contradicts yours, the easiest psychological move is to assume their vision is false, because accepting that their vision might be equally valid would require you to doubt the reliability of your own experience, which is psychologically much more difficult and threatening. The people of Svetograd were caught in a trap. where each person's subjective certainty about their own experiences made it impossible to reach collective truth. Everyone was certain they were right, because their experiences felt undeniably real and holy. But certainty is not the same as truth, and when multiple certain people have contradictory certainties, the result is not clarity but chaos. This problem extends far beyond religious contexts. Consider political polarization, where people consume different media and live in different information ecosystems, leading them to have genuinely different perceptions of reality. Each side is certain they're right, not out of malice or stupidity, but because their lived experience and the information they've encountered genuinely supports their view. The result, as in Svetograd, is not productive dialogue, but mutual accusation of deception and bad faith. Or consider the phenomenon of false memories, where people can have vivid, detailed, emotionally powerful memories of events that never occurred. These memories feel absolutely real to the person experiencing them. They have all the phenomenological qualities of genuine memories, yet they can be demonstrably false. The existence of false memories should make us humble about trusting our own experiences, yet most of us continue to trust our memories implicitly, because the alternative, accepting that our own mind might be generating convincing fictions, is too unsettling. The people of Svetograd face the same unsettling possibility with their visions, and like most of us would, they couldn't accept it. It was easier to believe that others were deceived than to accept that their own experiences might be unreliable. And so they spiraled deeper into conflict, each person clinging to their own certainty, while the community collapsed around them. There's a detail in one of the surviving accounts that I find particularly haunting. A mother and daughter both received visions on the same night. The mother's vision told her that her daughter was in spiritual danger and needed to leave Svetograd immediately. The daughter's vision told her that her mother was being deceived and that leaving the village would mean abandoning her divine calling. Both women loved each other deeply. Both were sincere believers. Both were absolutely certain that their vision was genuine and the other's was false. They argued for hours, each pleading with the other to see reason, to recognize the truth, to trust the vision they had received. The daughter pointed out that her vision had included specific details that later proved accurate, which seemed to validate its divine source. The mother countered that her vision had been accompanied by overwhelming feelings of maternal love and protective urgency, which surely came from God. Neither could convince the other. Eventually, the daughter stayed and the mother left, and they never saw each other again. The daughter was among those found dead when the investigating priests arrived. This story captures the tragedy of Svetograd more powerfully than any theological analysis could. These were not strangers or enemies, but a mother and daughter who loved each other, torn apart by incompatible certainties about divine communication. There was no villain in this story, no evil person who deliberately caused suffering. There were only people trying their best to be faithful to what they understood as divine truth, and that faithfulness destroyed them. It makes you wonder, what would have saved them? What could they have done differently? The obvious answer is that they should have been more skeptical of their experiences, more willing to doubt, more humble about their ability to distinguish divine communication from other mental phenomena. But this is easier said than done. When you're having a powerful religious experience, when you're feeling what seems like the presence of God, when you're receiving information that appears to come from a source beyond yourself, in that moment, skepticism feels like faithlessness. Doubt feels like betrayal of the divine gift you've been given. This is a paradox at the heart of religious experience. The qualities that make an experience feel authentic and holy are the same qualities that make us vulnerable to deception. The overwhelming sense of presence, the feeling of absolute certainty, the perception of receiving knowledge from beyond ourselves, these are precisely the characteristics that prevent us from questioning the experience. If you're experiencing something you believe to be divine communication, the last thing you want to do is doubt it, because doubt feels like rejecting God. But perhaps that's exactly what's needed. Perhaps genuine spiritual maturity requires the courage to doubt even our most powerful experiences, to question even our most certain convictions, to accept that our minds are capable of generating convincing illusions, and that sincerity is no protection against self-deception. Perhaps the most faithful response to any claimed divine communication is not immediate trust, but careful, patient, humble investigation. The medieval church had some understanding of this, which is why they developed elaborate procedures for testing mystical experiences and visions. They understood that not every religious experience was reliable, that spiritual discernment was essential, that even sincere believers could be deceived, but their tools for discernment were limited by their lack of psychological and neurological knowledge. They could distinguish between experiences that aligned with church doctrine and those that didn't, but they had no way to distinguish between genuine mystical experiences and powerful hallucinations or delusions that happen to have orthodox content. Modern science has given us better tools for understanding religious experiences. We know about the neurology of mystical states, the psychology of religious belief, the social dynamics of religious communities. We know that certain drugs can produce experiences indistinguishable from spontaneous mystical visions. We know that sleep deprivation, fasting, sensory deprivation, and rhythmic practices like chanting can alter consciousness in ways that feel spiritually significant. We know that group dynamics and social pressure can induce shared hallucinations and collective delusions. This knowledge is both liberating and threatening. It's liberating because it gives us more tools for evaluating religious experiences, more ways to distinguish potentially genuine spiritual encounters from psychological or neurological phenomena. But it's threatening because it suggests that many, perhaps most, religious experiences might have naturalistic explanations, that the visions and voices people experience might be product of their own minds rather than communications from divine sources. For believers, this creates a difficult dilemma. Do you use scientific knowledge to evaluate and potentially discount religious experiences at the risk of missing genuine divine communication? Or do you preserve openness to such communication at the risk of being deceived by your own psychology? There's no easy answer, but the story of Svetograd suggests that the risk of uncritical acceptance is far greater than the risk of skepticism. If the people of Svetograd had been more willing to consider naturalistic explanations for their experiences, if they had asked whether contaminated grain or group psychology or other ordinary factors might account for visions, they might have been able to step back from the escalating chaos. But they never seriously considered these possibilities, because doing so would have required them to doubt the reality of divine communication, which felt like doubting God itself. This is why fundamentalism of any kind is so dangerous. When you're absolutely certain about your beliefs, when you're convinced that you have access to absolute truth, when you believe that doubt is a form of faithlessness, then you're vulnerable to exactly the kind of catastrophe that destroyed Svetograd. Certainty is the enemy of wisdom. Doubt, properly understood, is not the opposite of faith, but its necessary companion. The theologian Paul Tillich wrote about the courage to be, the spiritual and psychological strength required to accept uncertainty and ambiguity, while still choosing to live meaningfully and ethically. He argued that mature faith is not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to commit to a path despite doubt, to act with conviction while maintaining humility about one's own fallibility. This kind of faith that includes doubt, that accepts uncertainty, that remains open to being wrong, might have saved Svetograd. But this is not the kind of faith that most religious traditions promote. Most traditions emphasize conviction, certainty, trust in divine guidance. They celebrate the faith of Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his son based on what he believed was a divine command. They admire the apostles, who left everything to follow Jesus based on their certainty that he was the Messiah. They hold up as models those who were absolutely certain of their religious truths and willing to die for them. And yet, history is full of people who were absolutely certain they were following divine guidance and who committed atrocities as a result. History is full of religious conflicts where both sides were equally certain of their divine mandate. History is full of sincere believers who destroyed themselves and others because they trusted their religious experiences without adequate skepticism. Svetograd is just one example among many, but it's particularly instructive because it shows how this dynamic can unfold even in a small, isolated community of genuinely devout people. If it could happen there, it can happen anywhere. The question is not whether religious experience can be dangerous. Clearly it can, but how we can engage with such experiences in ways that minimize the danger while remaining open to whatever genuine wisdom or insight they might contain. One possible answer comes from Buddhist traditions, which have been grappling with this question for millennia. Buddhist meditation practices can produce powerful visions, mystical experiences, and altered states of consciousness. But Buddhist teachers consistently warn against getting attached to these experiences or treating them as signs of spiritual advancement. In Zen, there's a saying, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." The point is not literal violence, but rather a warning against reifying any particular experience or image as the ultimate truth. Any experience, no matter how profound or apparently holy, is still just an experience, arising and passing away in consciousness, not to be clung to or mistaken for final truth. This attitude of acknowledging religious experiences while not being enslaved to them might have saved Svetograd. If the people there had been able to say, "Yes, I had a powerful vision, but it's just a vision, not necessarily a reliable guide to action," they might have avoided the worst of the chaos. But their entire religious framework taught them to trust such experiences, to see them as direct communications from God that demanded obedience. And so they had no defense when those experiences multiplied and contradicted each other. There's also a lesson here about community structure and decision-making. Svetograd had a hierarchical structure with the abbot at the top, but that structure collapsed when individual visionary experiences were granted authority equal to or greater than institutional leadership. This raises questions about how religious communities should be organized. Should they be hierarchical, with clear authority structures that can override individual experiences? Or should they be democratic, trusting in the collective wisdom of community? Or something else entirely? The evidence from Svetograd suggests that neither pure hierarchy nor pure democracy works well when dealing with competing claims to divine authority. The hierarchy collapsed because the abbot had no way to enforce his judgments against people who claimed direct divine mandate. But democracy would have been no better, because there was no rational basis for adjudicating between the competing visions. It would have just been a contest of who could gather more followers for their interpretation. What might have worked is a more flexible, experimental approach, treating the visions as hypotheses to be tested rather than truths to be obeyed. If someone received a vision saying to do X, the community could have tried doing X on a small scale, observe the results, and adjust accordingly. If a vision proved to have harmful consequences, it could be rejected, regardless of how holy or authentic it felt to the person receiving it. This would have required a fundamental shift in how they understood divine communication, not as commands requiring immediate obedience, but as suggestions requiring careful evaluation. But again, this would have required a level of skepticism and flexibility that their religious tradition didn't provide. They were trained to see obedience to divine commands as the highest virtue, questioning such commands as sinful pride. And so when the commands multiplied and contradicted each other, they had no framework for stepping back and asking whether the entire phenomenon might be something other than divine communication. In the end, Svetograd teaches us that the problem is not religious experience itself, but how we interpret and respond to such experiences. Visions, voices, mystical states. These are part human experience and probably always will be. The question is whether we treat them as self-validating truths or as interesting phenomena that require careful evaluation, whether we respond with immediate obedience or with thoughtful discernment, whether we privilege subjective certainty or objective outcomes. The fate of Svetograd suggests that subjective certainty without objective verification is a recipe for disaster, but it also suggests that objective verification without some respect for subjective experience leaves us impoverished, cut off from potentially meaningful dimensions of human consciousness and existence. The challenge is finding a balance, being open to religious experience while maintaining the critical faculties to evaluate such experiences, neither dismissing them entirely nor accepting them uncritically. This balance is difficult to achieve, perhaps impossible to sustain consistently. But the alternative, the uncritical acceptance of religious experience that destroyed Svetograd, is clearly unacceptable. Better to err on the side of skepticism than to repeat that tragedy. Today, the valley where Svetograd once stood is largely reclaimed by nature. Trees grow through the ruins of the monastery. The village houses have collapsed into piles of stone. The spring still flows, its water neither holy nor cursed, but simply water, chemistry and physics with no supernatural properties, except those we project onto it. Visitors who come there report a sense of sadness, of loss, of potential unfulfilled. Some say the place feels haunted, though whether by actual ghosts or by the weight of historical tragedy is impossible to say. There are no voices in Svetograd anymore, or at least none that the occasional visitors report hearing. The cacophony that destroyed the community has long since fallen silent. In that silence, there's both absence and presence. The absence of the community that once thrived there, but also the presence of a cautionary tale that still has the power to speak to us across the centuries. Because the fundamental question Svetograd raises remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. How do we distinguish genuine divine communication from the countless other voices, psychological, social, neurological, that can speak with equally convincing authority? How do we maintain openness to transcendent truth while protecting ourselves from deception and delusion? How do we honor religious experience without being enslaved to it? These questions are not merely historical or philosophical. They're practical, urgent, relevant to anyone who takes seriously the possibility of spiritual reality. In an age where fundamentalism is rising, where people are increasingly certain of their beliefs and increasingly unable to understand those who disagree with them, where subjective conviction often matters more than objective evidence. In such an age, the lesson of Svetograd is more relevant than ever. The voices that destroyed Svetograd didn't sound evil or demonic. They sounded holy. They promised blessing and truth. They came with all the phenomenological markers of authentic divine communication. And that's precisely what made them so dangerous. If destructive forces always announce themselves clearly, we could simply avoid them. But they don't. They disguise themselves as angels of light. They speak in the language of devotion and faith. They promise to lead us to truth while leading us to destruction. The only defense against such voices is the willingness to doubt, to question, to test our experiences against reality and ethics and long-term consequences. It's the courage to say, I had a powerful experience, but I might be wrong about what it means. It's the humility to accept that our most certain convictions might be our most dangerous delusions. It's the wisdom to value outcomes over experiences, actions over feelings, long-term consequences over immediate certainty. These are not qualities that come naturally to human beings. We want certainty. We want to trust our experiences. We want to believe that when we feel something powerfully, it must be true. And religious traditions often reinforce these desires, teaching that doubt is weakness and certainty is strength, that trusting our spiritual experiences is faith and questioning them is sin. But Svetograd teaches us the opposite. Doubt is strength. Questioning is wisdom. And the most faithful response to any claimed divine communication might be not trust, but careful, patient, humble investigation. Not immediate obedience, but thoughtful discernment. Not certainty, but a willingness to remain uncertain, while still choosing to act ethically and compassionately. The monks who survived Svetograd and spent the rest of their lives in other monasteries carried this lesson with them. In their old age, when asked for spiritual advice, they would often say the same thing. Beware of voices that claim to speak for God. The true voice of God, if it exists at all, is quieter than our thoughts, gentler than our feelings, and it never demands immediate obedience. It invites, it suggests, it whispers, and it can always be distinguished by one quality. It makes us more humble, more loving, more willing to doubt ourselves and extend grace to others. Any voice that makes us more certain, more judgmental, more willing to condemn others, that voice is not divine, no matter how holy it sounds. This is a wisdom purchased at terrible cost in a remote valley 7 centuries ago. The question is whether we're willing to learn from it, or whether we're doomed to repeat the pattern, hearing voices that claim divine authority, trusting our experiences over evidence, and discovering too late that faith without doubt is not faith at all, but a form of madness that can destroy everything we claim to hold sacred. In the end, when faith turns into fear, it's not because faith itself is dangerous. It's because certainty masquerading as faith is dangerous. Real faith, faith that includes doubt, that remains humble, that tests itself against ethics and outcomes, is not only safe but necessary. It's the foundation of genuine community, authentic spiritual growth, and the kind of wisdom that survives contact with reality. The ruins of Svetograd stand as a memorial to what happens when we forget this distinction, when we mistake certainty for faith and obedience for wisdom. They stand as a warning that the most dangerous voices are not those that sound evil, but those that sound holy, that the greatest threat to genuine faith comes not from atheism or skepticism, but from a counterfeit faith that requires no doubt, tolerates no questions, and mistakes its own certainty for divine truth. This is a lesson written in stone and silence in a forgotten valley in the Carpathian Mountains. This is a story of how heaven's whispers became hell's screams. This is what happens when faith turns into fear. May we have the wisdom to remember it and the courage to live differently because of it.